In this video, Jordan Peterson explains why we're obsessed with good and evil.
Now, why we're obsessed with good and evil is a very difficult thing to understand. I think it has something to do with our self-consciousness. I think that because I don't really... If you're an animal, you can be a predator, but if you're a human being, you can take it past that, because if you're self-conscious, you can understand your own vulnerability. You know what will hurt you. As soon as you know what can hurt you, you know what can hurt other people. And as soon as you know what can hurt you and what can hurt other people, then you can make a choice between good and evil, because you can start to hurt other people just for the sake of hurting them. You know, and that's as close to evil as I think it gets. And people have been trying to conceptualize that because they are trying to conceptualize as well how it is that human affairs can go dreadfully wrong, insofar as that can be laid at human feet. You know, sometimes it's earthquakes and sometimes it's floods, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's people causing trouble for the sake of trouble. And the human race has been trying to understand the personality characteristics of that mode of action for thousands of years. And a lot of that's emerged up in mythology and stories, and more than in philosophy. It's like the bad guy in a movie. It's like Loki, you know, that's a good example. That's a good example of that sort of thing popping up in relatively modern culture. You know, what's the embodiment of evil? And that's what Milton was trying to figure out when he wrote Paradise Lost, you know, and he was taking all these stories about satanic forces and hell that had collected in human culture for thousands and thousands of years, and trying to sort them out and make some sense out of them, some narrative sense, you know. And he believed that the fundamentally evil impulse, the most evil impulse, which you could characterize evil as a meta-personality that exists across people, because if you do something evil and you do something evil and you do something evil, it's like there's some commonality across that. You can extract out the commonalities and you can say, well, that's what this personality is like. But then you can also say, well, that's a very powerful, it's a meta-personality, it's something that will never die, and it's something that can actually possess people. You know, and if you don't think that, you know, that that's possible, then, you know, you probably don't know that serial killers tend to compete with one another. You know, these sorts of things, they're not fictions. And the people who shoot up high schools, they're pretty damn informed about the last person who did the same thing, and generally they're trying to do a better job. So, you know, this is serious matters. And Milton's analysis, you know, he wrote what was considered the greatest poem in the English language, which, roughly speaking, is Paradise Lost. And what Milton concluded, and this is like a phenomenological statement, you know, when we talked about the phenomenologists, we talked about them trying to wrestle with the question of what constituted being, you know, and human being. What's the nature of your experience, and what's your relationship to that experience, you know? And the phenomenologists and the existentialists claimed that the proper relationship was one of truth, fundamentally. Milton basically conceptualized Satan, and that's his personification of evil, as either the embodiment of, or the force behind, you can read it either way, of the mind that has made its decision that being itself is evil and should be eradicated. If you read the Columbine Killers, the literary one, if you read his writings, it's exactly what he concluded. He concluded that being as such was flawed. You know, people were contemptible. Being itself was unsupportable ethically because there was too much suffering. It was too flawed, and the best thing to do was to eradicate it. And so Milton conceptualized evil as resentment against being. Now, in Milton's language, that was resentment against God, but it boils down to exactly the same thing. You know, and you can understand this. So that would be like the archetypal roots of resentment. That's the way a Jungian would look at it. And, you know, you'll see in your life that resentment will emerge. Like, it'll emerge anytime something you regard as unfair happens specifically to you. You know, and if it's bad enough, you'll not only be irritated and angry and hostile and self-pitying and destructive, and looking for revenge because of it. All those things that will happen, and it's almost inevitable. But if you take that far enough, then you get to the bottom of that, and the bottom of it is that it would be just as well in your estimation if everything that lived ceased to exist. It's interesting because not only did Milton come to that conclusion, the great German philosopher and author and poet Goethe came to exactly the same conclusion. He believed when he wrote Faust, and Faust starred Mephistopheles among others, so Mephistopheles was an avatar of evil fundamentally. His basic creed was that existence itself is so terrible in its fundamental nature, so tragic and flawed, that it would be better if we just brought the whole thing to an end. Now you think, that's a pretty damn powerful philosophy actually, and believe me, there'll be times in your life where you think that, especially when something really terrible happens to someone really close to you, in some arbitrary way, you know. Maybe you'll have a child that becomes extremely ill in some painful manner, you know, and that'll be enough to make you shake your fist at heaven. The problem with that attitude, as far as I can tell, because I've traced it, I've tried to understand what are the logical conclusions to adopting that attitude. And the logical conclusion is that you take a bad situation and you make it worse. And that, to me, that means it's logically incoherent. If the problem you're trying to solve is the fact that being is flawed in a deep way and it's tragic and that people suffer and that they suffer unjustly, you're making the presupposition that that's wrong, that it shouldn't happen. The fact that it's happening is what undoes the whole project of being, so to speak. And so what that means is that if you actually believe that and you're acting in accordance with that, then the one thing you should not do is make it worse. And I can tell you, the one thing that will make it worse is if you adopt that attitude. It will get worse. It'll get worse, and at some point you'll be happy that it's getting worse. And at some point after that, not only will you be happy that it's getting worse, but you'll be doing everything that your imagination allows you to conceive to make it worse and worse and worse, faster and faster. You know, and there's a mythological conception of hell, and one of the elements of that mythological conception is that it's a bottomless pit. And the reason for that, I believe, is that there is nothing that is so awful that you can't make it worse if you just try. So, and I've seen situations like that a lot. I've seen, you know, families locked in absolutely homicidal, unconscious battles where every single person in the family was doing absolutely everything they could to make sure that no one was going to escape from that, and that it was going to get a hell of a lot worse.